Hi everyone, good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you. For Paige Strong, the wedding of both twin daughters on the same day was the sweetest thing she had experienced in years, and maybe even in life in general. With tears in her eyes, as she looked at her beautiful daughters, she felt an inner pride that she could touch their happiness just a little bit. Coincidentally, the twin daughters were friends in every way and even decided to have their wedding on the same day, once again pleasing their beloved mother. The news of such a remarkable event in the life of Paige Strong spread outside the area. It was rumored that someone even posted a note about it on one of the country's news sites. In addition to two twin daughters, everyone was well aware that Paige had two adult sons. In the local environment of this family is considered exemplary, but few people knew that their mother had gone through an unthinkable ordeal that fell on her hard, womanly lot. Unfortunately, only Paige and her sons could be present on the bride's side, since her husband had died of a serious illness several years ago. "What beautiful daughters you have. Be happy, Judy and Candy," Paige said, wiping away a tear. To ensure that the wedding went as it should, the parents of the newlyweds spared no expense to make it happen. Exquisite dishes from restaurants, expensive drinks, live music on an improvised stage, and crowds of waiters in smart livery, with the first request of the guests paced back and forth with trays. Some of the invitees enjoyed the delicious food, and some, on the contrary, tasted all sorts of drinks. The party reached its climax only when a tall, handsome man appeared on the stage and took a microphone in his hands. At first, no one paid any attention to him. Who knows, someone under the influence of alcohol wanted to sing another intoxicating song. Meanwhile, the stranger on stage, coughing embarrassedly, then ran his hand through his hair and congratulated the newlyweds on their wedding day. Understanding that the man came out not only for that, the orchestra looked questioningly, waiting what tune the guest would order. The stranger smiled, then approached the nearest musician and asked him to play a simple tune. At first, the sound of his voice could not drown out the hum of drunken guests, which resembled the hum of a beehive. But then, as the man got into a rage and his voice gained strength, there was silence at the tables of the celebrants. Everyone stared at the stage and could not believe what they were hearing from the lips of this stately, gray-haired man. And he sang and sang, something of his own, something of his own, something that touched the soul of all those who were among the guests invited to the wedding. Some saw in his words their past, some saw their present, and some even saw a prerequisite for their future. Hearing the guest's pleasant baritone, Paige shuddered, and then tears welled up in her eyes. Not because of the joy of her daughter's weddings, but because of who she saw on the stage at that very moment. The woman's heart raced at the thought that the man standing on the stage might have had something to do with her past. No, this can't be happening. It's all just a dream. But no matter how much the woman rubbed her eyes or pinched her shoulder, nothing disappeared. The man still sang in his soulful voice, causing the audience to applaud loudly. Before she had even heard the end of the song, Paige was sure she would have recognized that voice among the hundreds of millions of applicants. Tears spurted from the woman's eyes that burned her cheeks in salty, bitter stream. A storm of emotion and frenzied emotion swept over Paige, causing her to plunge into the whirlpool of the past, which swirled her in a string of memories, images, and scenes from her life. The woman was completely immersed in a past in which she lived in a run-down village in the north of our vast country. Her parents did not live rich, so from an early age they restricted their daughter in everything they could. They did not starve the girl, and she did not have unnecessary toys. At school, little Paige went to things given to her by cousins and brothers whose parents were actively engaged in farming. Paige loved her mother and father very much, considering them the closest and dearest people. Of all her valuables, The girl had only a gold pendant given to her by her grandmother. Despite the fact that Paige performed well in school, her parents did not expect their daughter to go to university or technical school. These are all pleasures for the rich, daughter. Mother and I can't afford a big city, so you should stay here and live like everyone else, my mother said admonishingly. In Paige's own opinion, it was wrong, but she did not oppose her mother and accepted it as it was. When Paige graduated from high school, her parents expectedly married her off to Eddie, the tractor driver. Her fiancé had only an old car that could have fallen apart on the road. You don't mind that he lives a bit poor. A tractor driver and in the countryside. He'll always have money. And what if he drinks? Who doesn't drink nowadays if life is like that? And we have no suitors here, you know. Paige told her mother. To be fair, Eddie was not a bad-looking man, and were it not for his addiction to alcohol, he would certainly have made a good and loving husband for Paige. And since once a month the spouse steadily hit a binge, he was invariably fired from his job for that very reason. Then Eddie repented and begged forgiveness from his boss, his wife, and everyone else he could. He swore he wouldn't put another drop in his mouth, which he believed at the time. But time passed, and it all happened again. Paige tried to influence her husband. She persuaded him, shamed him, scolded him, but it had no effect. The wife even took him to Gwyneth, a well-known healer in the area, who, in her own opinion, could rid all those who asked her to do so. But the main difficulty was that Eddie didn't want to quit drinking, so all the efforts of the old herbalist were in vain. Probably, if Paige had not gotten pregnant at that moment, her marriage to Eddie, which was bursting at the seams, would have ended in divorce. And so the woman had to accept reality as it was, and believe that having a baby would make her husband reconsider his attitude toward life. Throughout her pregnancy, Paige felt unwell. Toxicosis and dizziness became her constant companions for the next 6 to 7 months. During that time, she saw Eddie sober only 2 or 3 times. After giving birth to her baby boy, Matthew, Paige put all her energy into making sure he had everything he needed. For a while, her husband even stopped drinking and got a regular job. But as soon as he touched a drink, all the hard-earned money went to alcohol. Her parents predictably did not support Paige in her quest to divorce Eddie. Daughter, that's not the way it is in the country. It's the way it is here. You know it. You choose a husband and live with him for the rest of your life. It's in the cities, rich people spend their whole life getting married, but they can't find happiness. It's different here, my mother said. Paige bravely endured her husband's poverty and drunkenness for 7 long years before realizing that she could no longer live like that. For starters, the woman wanted a change of scenery and to improve the financial condition of her family. There was only one way to do that, to go to the city to earn money. Eddie was against it, and in his groggy state he made a terrible row with breaking of dishes and slamming of doors. With tears in her eyes tearing away her beloved son Matthew, the woman left him with her parents. She understood that the bitter drunkard husband would not be able to care for her son properly, and instead of a bottle of milk would invariably spend the money on booze. Despite her husband's protests, Paige was firm in her decision to leave and start a new life. At the same time, all she could think about was making money and gaining independence from Eddie. Needless to say, it was hard for Paige to raise the money for the ticket. Her parents took her decision with reluctance, but then they accepted her daughter's decision and even gave her some money. So a woman from a provincial village had to leave the confines of her community for the first time in her life. Paige decided to go to the capital itself, which she considered at the time the center of the universe. Since the train ride was several hours long, it was to be expected that she would fall asleep. It was the coach, since the woman simply had no money for a compartment. Paige awoke only when the speaker announced the arrival in the capital. Squinting sleepily, the woman rose from the bench and looked around. That's when Paige learned that her purse and all her money had been taken from her purse. The thieves hadn't touched her passport or the pendant in her inside pocket. They'd probably just missed it in a hurry. With tears in her eyes, Paige stepped out of the wagon and looked around for someone who could help with her problem. But when Paige briefly outlined the situation to a passing policeman, the policeman just threw up his hands and said that most likely the thieves were long gone, and therefore there was no way to get the money back. How is that possible? I've seen on TV. What now? You can practically see everything on the security cameras or something, Paige began timidly. In response, the police officer only shook his head indifferently. What am I going to do now? I don't even have the money to go home, Paige pleaded, trying to catch up with the policeman. At this moment, the city that seemed so hospitable and fairy tale took her unkindly, as if she were her stepfather's daughter. Wiping away her bitter tears, Paige stepped onto the platform, and sitting on a bench, we wept bitterly. Passers-by passed by and looked at her as if she were a leper, trying not to come within a meter of her. Probably at that moment they thought that they could be infected with the virus of unhappiness, which was radiating from the shrunken provincial girl. Paige, on the other hand, was bitter that life had treated her so unfairly, taking away the only chance she had. Despair swallowed Paige whole, making her heart suffer even more. At that moment, the woman was ready to do anything to get her money back. Suddenly, someone gently touched Paige's shoulder. "Hey, why are you crying?" "Did something happen?" asked someone in a pleasant baritone. The woman turned around hopefully and saw in front of her a young guy wearing a shabby jacket, holey jeans, and the same sneakers, which were in an extremely tired state. Paige looked at the stranger with disbelief, and then cautiously answered, "It happened, as you can see. But what do you care?" Framp was visibly embarrassed. "I do not really care, but a woman's tears are like a knife to my heart. Don't worry, I'm not a thief, and I've never taken anyone else's in my life," the homeless man replied, even more embarrassed. "I see now that you didn't. If you did, you wouldn't look like a bum right now," Paige blurted out in a huff, then stopped short for fear of offending a man she didn't know. "I'm sorry. I got upset. The money was stolen from me on the train. I came here from far away. I can't go back home. You know what I mean." "And there's no money," Paige said. The tramp sighed understandingly, then said, "I see. Do you have the pendant? You could sell it?" "Not as much as I'd like, of course. But I have the right people. That'll give you money for the first time, and then we'll see." Paige looked at her interlocutor with disbelief. "Don't be afraid. I won't cheat. I don't have anything sacred at all," the vagabond hastened to assure her. Soon, Paige was hurrying after her savior, who was leading her through some nooks and crannies that would have confused anyone. Finally, the stranger led the woman to an inconspicuous pawn shop which, judging by the loud-sounding slogan on the sign, accepted anything possible. After examining Paige's pendant, the appraiser gave his verdict. "Well, I can still give you a couple of $12, but that's all he's worth." "Why so little?" "It's gold and very dear to me. My grandmother gave it to me for my birthday." Paige asked, almost crying. "I have little interest in who gave it to me and when. If the price doesn't suit you, then look elsewhere. How do I know whose pendant it is? Maybe you two stole it together." "There is no receipt for the purchase," said the appraiser, in an impertinent tone. Paige glanced at the tramp and then nodded her head in agreement. She had no better choice at the moment, and so, in her own opinion, she'd rather have a bird in the hand than a ghostly crane in the sky. As it turned out a little later, the stranger's name was Harry, and he'd been wandering the streets for several years. "And where's your home or parents?" Paige cautiously inquired. "What kind of parents could there be? I grew up in an orphanage. You know what I mean? Life there was no fun, so I ran away from time to time. Last time I ran away when I was 16, along with some older guys. So my life went downhill. But I was never in jail, and I wasn't a murderer. When I was young, of course, I could still steal a bread roll or an apple from a busy peddler, but now I work as a scrap metal collector, a part-time loader, a cardboard salesman. I've got enough bread but no butter. And black breadcrumbs, Harry summed up humorously. At that moment, Paige felt a twinge of conscience. She'd thought she'd been living badly all this time, and in fact there were people in the world who were living 100 times worse. At least I have parents. But at least this poor guy has no one, Paige thought to herself. After chatting with Harry some more, the woman decided to start looking for lodging. She was also helped in this by the tramp, who pointed out the right man, who was just renting a cheap room. Grunkle Stan's nice. Even if he drinks, he's quiet and doesn't hurt the tenants. When you go to him, buy him a bottle and tell him you came from me. Maybe he'll give you a discount too, said Harry. Our heroine nodded understandingly and said goodbye to the tramp. Grunkle Stan really turned out to be a normal man who drank only because he had lost his beloved wife and daughter in a car accident. Otherwise, he was an intelligent and calm man. Well, it's not so bad, this capital, Paige thought as she lay down on the hard bed. As it turned out, she hadn't had a poppy seed in her mouth that day. But the important thing was that she managed to find a place to live and get at least some of the money from the sale of the pendant. Fortunately, Paige was not destined to sleep hungry that night. Grunkle Stan turned out to be a man of understanding and gave her a plate of soup with a piece of black bread. With tears in her eyes, she looked at her landlord and thanked him heartily. Come on, I don't get it. You're old enough to be my daughter. You look just like my Carmen. It made my heart ache, said the old man, and went to his room. The next morning, Paige woke up at dawn. Now, she had to do whatever it took to find the job she had come to the capital for. Unfortunately, finding a suitable job for a girl from the provinces was not as easy as Paige thought at first. Naive, provincial, had to go around a dozen places before luck smiled on the visitor to the capital in the form of elegantly dressed woman in her 50s, whom she ran into on the doorstep of a recruitment agency. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm so clumsy, Paige said apologetically. No, nothing, said the stranger, then looked at Paige carefully. You must be looking for a job, honey, the woman asked cautiously. Yes. How did you guess? Asked Paige, surprised. I can see it in your eyes. Forgive me for being frank, but I wouldn't advise you to go to this agency. They'll cheat you. Let's do this. You come to work for me. My husband and I need a housekeeper. You're a bright young girl, I see. I think you'll get the hang of it. And if you want, I'll provide you with a place to live. You can stay in the guest house for the time being, the woman answered. Tears glistened in Paige's eyes. Of course, I agree. Here, I'm ready to start right now. Great. My name is Ashley Morrison. Please love me, the woman added with a smile. Paige introduced herself, after which the woman's face cleared and a sweet smile played on her lips. What a good name you have. Really inspiring, Ashley Morrison added. Then she patted Paige on the shoulder encouragingly, and skillfully maneuvering through the crowd of passers-by, she led the way. Ashley Morrison was the owner of a chain of beauty salons and several perfume stores, which brought her a steady income. Her husband, Andrew Winston, was also in business, which kept their family income consistently high, giving the businessman the opportunity to have servants in the house. What was most interesting was that Ashley Morrison did not treat Paige as a servant, and so their conversation resembled more of a conversation between two friends than a working dialogue. Paige told her companion about the village she grew up in, her parents, and, of course, the reasons that brought her to the capital. Hey, you should have gotten a divorce. You should have taken the baby and come here with him, Ashley Morrison said with a sad sigh. Upon arrival, the woman introduced Paige to her duties and showed her the house. The housekeeper was very understanding of the housekeeper. She was never mean to her. Together, they cooked delicious meals that invariably pleased the owner of the house. A month flew by. During that time, Paige had at least gotten used to the capital and was no longer the frightened provincial girl who flinched at every rustle and was afraid of every shadow. She missed her son Matthew a lot, called his mother almost every day, asked how he was, what he was doing, if he was healthy, and when she got her paycheck, she sent most of it home. One day, while rushing to work, the woman met Harry, the tramp who had helped her on the first day of her arrival in the capital. "Hey, how are you? Grunkle Stan isn't hurting you?" asked Harry. No, it's okay. He's a good man. I think he's even drinking less now that I'm here. He says I look like his daughter," Paige said. After chatting with Harry some more, she hurried to work. The next day, Paige met the familiar hobo, again, outside the front door of the apartment building. It was obvious that the guy was waiting for her on purpose, though he didn't want to show it. Seeing that he was hiding something behind his back, Paige smiled. "Here's one for you," Harry said bravely, and held out a small rose. It was probably plucked from the city flower bed, but that didn't matter to Paige at the moment. At that moment, our heroine sighed deeply, trying to calm the excitement of her heart. She had received flowers for the first time in her life. Eddie had never given her any, not even daisies of the field. "Thank you so much," Paige replied, blushing embarrassedly. That day, she was literally floating on the wings because she felt like a woman. The flowers were given to her not by a prince on a white horse, but by an ordinary tramp, but all the same. The woman was very pleased. After the incident with the rose, Harry began to meet Paige after work, prudently standing away from the rich man's house. He was probably afraid of being mistaken for a thief, of being chased away, or even of being called to the police. He had a passport, of course, but you could get something illegal on any vagrant if you wanted to. One day, Ashley Morrison informed Paige that they were expecting influential relatives to visit on the occasion of her husband's 50th birthday. "Don't worry, my dear. It's going to be crowded, but we'll manage," Ashley Morrison reassured the housekeeper. "I'm not worried. In our village, we used to have weddings that took almost a week to get ready," Paige said. Ashley Morrison smiled and got down to business. That day, Paige stayed at work until almost 11 o'clock, much to the chagrin of Harry, who was soaking wet, waiting for her to return in the pouring rain. "Jesus, Harry, why did you wait for me?" The man's face immediately flashed with shame. "So, how did I know you were going to be late tonight? I wondered if those rich people had already turned you into a slave." He tried to make a joke. The next day, Ashley Morrison's house was full of guests, including a distant relative. John Smith was in his 60s, but he looked even older. As Paige learned from her landlady, the man had lost a son 6 months earlier. "How old was he?" asked Paige cautiously. 27 only. "Peter, their late baby," replied Ashley Morrison. That day, while serving guests, Paige was knocked off her feet, carrying trays from one corner of the table to the other. At one point, she even felt like a restaurant worker who found herself at some important event. Everything was going well until the moment when John Smith did not remember his son. At that, the man's eyes visibly moistened. "Don't bother him now. He's practically raised him alone. His wife died in childbirth," Ashley Morrison whispered in the housekeeper's ear. "Oh, what a horror. How did he manage all this?" Paige whispered, looking at the gray-haired man with respect. In his grief, John Smith went so far as to take a picture of his late son out of his jacket pocket and show it to everyone present. Many of them knew his son Peter personally. Others, on the other hand, saw him for the first time. Nancy, though she did not consider herself curious, decided to take a peek at the late businessman's son. Cautiously going behind his back, the woman took a closer look at the picture on the table. Suddenly, the face of the young man pictured on it, standing next to a brand-new car, seemed vaguely familiar to her. The same bump on his nose, the curly hair, the color of his eyes. "It's Harry," Paige exclaimed. At this point, everyone present looked at Ashley Morrison's housekeeper with judgment. "Young lady, you are definitely confused about something. That's my son, Peter," John Smith remarked, and was about to put the picture in his pocket. "No, I'm not confused. I saw him, see. He lives at the station. At this point, no one believed her. Not only that, some even ridiculed her assumption, calling her a fantasist. The page stubbornly stood her ground and continued to say that just a few hours ago, she talked to an exact copy of the deceased son of John Smith. The elderly businessman looked at the housekeeper with disbelief, but refrained from commenting. It was obvious from the girl's face that she sincerely believed in what she was saying. Seizing a moment when the guests had turned their attention to congratulating the Jubilee, John Smith walked up to Paige and softly said, "If so, then show me this tramp. I, of course, understand that people can be very similar, but I was curious and want to see it in person." Paige nodded and asked her to wait until after the party. She knew no one would let her go sooner, because after the event there would be a mountain of dishes that would not only have to be cleared off the table, but also washed. John Smith waited patiently for Paige to return and invited her into his car. "No, you don't have to. Harry might get the wrong idea. Anyway, let's go. It's not far," Paige said. As was his long-established habit, Harry stood in his usual spot at the intersection of two small streets. Seeing Paige in the company of a man he didn't know, the tramp visibly tensed. But as the pair came closer, the unbelievable happened. "No, it just can't be," whispered John Smith and grabbed his heart. "What's the matter with you? Are you sick?" whispered Paige, trying to support the weakening body of the businessman. Fortunately, Harry came to the rescue in time, and in spite of John Smith's expensive suit, he poured water over him from a nearby puddle. Eventually, it had an effect, and the businessman regained consciousness. He was gasping for air, like a beached fish, and saying only one thing: "Son. Son, you're my son." "Yeah. What kind of son am I, Uncle?" "You're confused," muttered Harry, helping the man to his senses. But John Smith kept saying the same thing, confirming the validity of Paige's words, who definitely saw a resemblance between Harry and the late son of the businessman, having persuaded the young man to come to his mansion. John Smith showed them a picture of his Peter. Only now Harry realized that he is an exact replica of the late son of a millionaire. "Wait, how can that be?" "I grew up in an orphanage, and I've never even seen my parents," Harry exclaimed. John Smith shrugged his shoulders as he stared at his newfound son. Certainly it was not his Peter, but it was an exact replica of him, with the same velvety voice, looks, and incredible charisma. As it turned out, John Smith's wife, Valerie Smith, was waiting at home with his adopted son, Jason. As Paige immediately realized, this woman had become John Smith's spouse after the death of his first wife. When she saw the guy enter with her husband, she turned deathly pale. Even her lips turned white. Barely heard the woman speak. "Peter, are you alive?" John Smith picked up almost unconscious spouse and confusedly began to explain. "Of course he's alive." "My son?" Jason stood silent. He looked at his resurrected brother and could not believe his eyes. The woman recovered a little and leaned on the arm of her son, who was as shaken as his mother, went to her room. Gesturing for Jason to leave her alone, she collapsed in her chair, so it was all for nothing. "But who is it? The son?" "What son it can't be, it's a double. It happens, doesn't it?" Valerie Smith poured herself a full glass of cognac and drank in a gulp without tasting the scalding drink. John Smith was then left with a newborn son in his arms after the death of his wife. He had enough money to hire a nanny to watch the baby around the clock, and he spent time with his son, whom he loved with all his heart, whenever he could. When Peter was 4 years old, he met a nurse in the hospital, a young woman who was raising her son, 5-year-old Jason, alone. After soberly weighing and thinking it over, John Smith proposed to Valerie. A good mother, a great hostess, would be a great match for her, and Peter and Jason, a peer, would be friends. Indeed, with Valerie's arrival in the house, it became much easier for the banker. She ran the house, watched the children, completely relieved the man of household chores and problems, except that she had disliked Peter from the very beginning. He had been in her way, preventing her from carrying out her cunning plan. John Smith, well aware that such a striking resemblance could not be accidental, took a DNA test, more to settle legal issues than for himself. The man knew for sure it was his son, for the heart could not lie, he believed. But the mystery remained. How could Harry be lost? John Smith contacted a private detective agency with an excellent reputation, and the guys were able to untangle the tangle rather quickly, in just a couple of weeks. Only 2 women were in labor that day, John Smith's wife and another woman who was a close relative of one of the midwives. By a fateful coincidence, this woman gave birth to a stillborn child, knowing that her sister would not survive the loss of her child. Since this pregnancy was very late and so desired, she switched children as John Smith's wife gave birth to twins. This act could in no way be justified, but there was no one to ask at the moment. The midwife, guilty of malfeasance, had long since died, and the woman who became his mother, just a year later, learned the truth from her and could not bring up another man's son. That's how Harry ended up in an orphanage. At the moment of solving the mystery, it seemed to Paige that her life had taken a sharp turn upward, and from now on, it would only be a white, lingering streak. In fact, things were very different, and it manifested itself primarily in the way Harry began to treat her. The unexpected wealth had turned the young man's head, and he paid less attention to Paige. He was understandable. After all, for so many years he had lived on the street, and he had not even dreamed that things could change so dramatically in his life. But problems were much more complicated, and they were associated primarily with the attitude of Valerie to the new stepson. After Peter's death, she and her son were the only legal heirs of the banker. We were talking about tens of millions, and the woman was well aware that with the sudden appearance of Harry, everything changed not in her favor. Valerie Smith disapproved of the affair between her stepson and her housekeeper, Ashley Morrison. The rich woman was angry, but there was nothing she could do about it. Harry and Paige fell in love with each other without memory, and therefore they did not care about the opinion of others. Enjoying each other's company, the young people indulged in dreams of a future in which they would be happy together. Unfortunately, they did not even realize that Valerie Smith had already made her plan for the future of her stepson. First of all, it was necessary to break off his relationship with Paige. After all, God forbid the son to get married, move into an apartment, and the plan will be much more difficult to implement. Under the guise of concern for Harry's future, she offered to send him to live in France. Honey, you know that in a linguistic environment, Harry would learn French in a year and study himself. You have to make up for lost time, don't you? John Smith agreed, even though he didn't want to part with his son. That's right, you can't do without a foreign language nowadays. And in Paris, you can organize an internship to teach Harry the basics of business. Harry did not feel particularly happy about the trip, but he did not oppose his father. After all, his father wants the best. No place without an education, especially in banking. The son left and promised to call, but when he arrived, he lost his phone, and with it, all his contacts. Paige never waited for a call and went to his parents to see if anything had happened. Valerie Smith, with feigned sympathy, told her that Harry in Paris had a fiancée. Whether it was true or not, it was difficult to check, but the woman had simply no reason not to trust Valerie Smith. Paige sobbed for days and nights, her heart just bursting with unbearable pain. Well, how could I have been so stupid as to believe an ex-tramp who was dizzy at the sight of untold riches? Of course, when you can live with a princess, you don't need some simpleton from a god-forsaken village, Paige thought. Staying in the city, Paige could not. After a heartfelt goodbye to the mistress, she decided to return to the village, because there her son, her parents. It will be easier to endure this pain, this betrayal. She did not know that fate has prepared for her a few more surprises that will change her life beyond recognition. Back in her hometown, Paige faced the same thing that had haunted her before. The same perpetual drinking husband, Eddie, and a life of dejection and despair. Realizing this, Paige fell into a deep depression from which it was almost impossible to get out. She realized that life was falling apart before her eyes. In the beginning, there were tantrums, tears, screaming, and then came the realization that this was her fate, from which there was no escaping. It seemed to her that with Harry leaving for another country, a piece of her soul was also left behind. Eddie did not know what exactly was causing his wife's melancholy, and pouring bitter pain into her heart, wrote it all off on his own account. And soon, Paige found out that she was pregnant. It was Harry's child, and there was no point in doubting it. Upon learning of his wife's pregnancy, Eddie pulled himself together and, to the surprise of many, overcame his addiction. Not only that, he took up farming, trying to make up for the lost years spent hugging a bottle of moonshine. Paige forgave her husband and held no grudge, especially since she knew that the child was not his. The real shock to her, however, was the result of the ultrasound, which showed twins. After giving birth to beautiful daughters Judy and Candy, Paige was able to heal her wounds and began to treat her husband as one of her own. Eddie took the news of the twins with joy. He worked day and night raising the farm, trying to earn money for his now small family. And it worked. The father of many children had golden hands. He repaired the equipment which had been long neglected at the collective farm and rented a dilapidated cowshed. Soon, the fame of the farm spread far beyond the region. Profitable contracts for the supply of agricultural products came from all corners of the country. It seemed to the woman that this was the happiness she had dreamed of for all these long years. A solid and close-knit family, her 3 favorite children and husband by her side. But once again, fate took a strange turn and gave Paige an unexpected surprise. The weather was nasty and rainy. Our heroine was walking to the farm, and suddenly, right on the road, she noticed a child about 5 years old, no more. He was skinny, wearing a tattered sweatshirt and ragged boots, his hair tangled and dirty. Paige's heart ached with pity, and she grabbed him in her arms and ran straight back home, the little boy weighing almost nothing, like a sparrow of light. After eating and warming up, the baby fell asleep at the table, and Paige moved him to the bed. At first, they took the boy for an ordinary waif, but then they found out that he was from the neighboring village. His mother had drunk, and his father had died somewhere on the watch. In the evening at the family council, they decided Chris was to be adopted. Eddie joked, "That's a good suggestion. A man's hands are always useful for work." So the family had another son, who, though not their own, was surrounded by love and care. Unfortunately, family happiness was short-lived. Eddie was found to have signs of a formidable disease whose mere name sent shivers down the spine of many. Apparently, he had had the disease himself before. It was just that he had no time to attend to his own health due to his rampant drunkenness. Knowing he was terminally ill, Eddie continued to run the farm. Paige helped him do that. She not only drove Eddie to all sorts of healers and luminaries of science, but also got him the scarce drugs that eventually prolonged his life. Though not for long, but still. Unfortunately, despite expensive chemotherapy sessions and innovative treatment methods, Eddie died 2 years after learning that he was doomed. God, why did I have to go through all this? I had just started to live a normal life. And now I'm alone again, Paige thought with tears in her eyes. Deep down, she didn't love Eddie, and she was only living with him for the children. Most likely the man understood this, but he did not want to bring up the awkward issue, which only arose because he had been a heavy drinker for most of his life. The most interesting thing was that during all this time, Harry had never once mentioned himself. But on the other hand, why would he do that when he had a bride in Paris and a happy, cloudless future? Several years passed. Still afraid to commit to any man, Paige devoted herself to raising her children, Matthew, Chris, Judy, and Candy, who were the focus of her life. The older her daughters grew, the more they resembled their father. Paige sighed, looking at them. When would the pain go away? How many years had passed, and the love was still alive, a faint flame, but it was still burning. When the children grew up and it was time for the sisters' wedding, the loving mother did everything possible to ensure that such a joyful event would be imprinted in their hearts forever. And now, as she couldn't stop crying at her daughter's wedding, Paige suddenly realized that she saw none other than Harry on stage. Where did he come from? How? Why? Thought the woman, and of course found no answer to her words. Much time had passed, and in her heart she kept the image of the young vagabond boy who had helped her at the station. Now in front of her stood an imposing man who could not be imagined as a tramp. It was probably another man who could not be a better man, similar to Harry in figure and voice, but no more than that. As he approached Paige, Harry put his arms around her, just as he had done for so many years. God, I can't believe my eyes, Harry. Is that you? Tell me it's true, Paige asked with tears in her eyes. The man smiled and then said only one word. Yes? As it turned out later, Valerie Smith, wishing to destroy their relationship, deliberately lied to Paige about his son finding a bride in Paris. In fact, all this time, Harry had no spouse, since he was convinced that his beloved Paige had died in an accident. How did she die? What accident? I just went back to my village, and that's it. The woman tried to justify herself. But Harry himself had already realized that this case was not without Valerie, who had run her tentacles here too, where she had no right to run them, in principle. In fact, the woman was motivated by lust for profit. But it turned out, unfortunately, only 5 years later after John Smith was gone. That's when Valerie Smith and her son Jason perked up. It turns out that all this time they had been waiting for a chance to grab John Smith's fortune. Not only that, but it was with their assistance that the fatal accident that cost Peter Smith his life took place. Probably a similar action was prepared for Harry, but life on the street was not in vain for him, and in time he was able to recognize the traitors in his house. John Smith indirectly helped him in this, as if anticipating something bad, managed to make a will before his death. According to it, all that was in use of the millionaire was fully passed to Harry, and Valerie and Jason were left with nothing. So how did you know I was alive? Asked Paige, wiping away a tear. I came across a post on social media about a wedding that was going to happen. At first I thought the last name looked familiar, and then I checked and found out that you were Judy and Candy's mother, Harry explained. At that moment, tears flowed from Paige's eyes. Sweetheart, Harry, you don't know the most important thing, Paige whispered. Judy and Candy are your daughters, the woman said, her voice trembling with excitement. To say that Harry was shocked was an understatement. He hadn't even realized that he'd unwittingly congratulated his own daughters on their wedding day by arriving at a wedding with girls he didn't know. Taking Paige in his arms, Harry whirled her around, trying not to notice the condemning glances of the invited guests. Perhaps this is the real happiness, which had to be suffered and carried in his heart for many, many years. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.